It's a great pleasure to be here. I have to say, it's particularly a great pleasure to be in Washington right now because as I was writing this book, it was a book about people who came to Washington very much at a time like this, a time when the country was troubled, and yet there was change in the federal government. There was a sense of excitement. And when I got off the train this morning in Union Station, something that Frances Perkins herself did a couple days before Inauguration Day, I could feel the energy already in the air. So it's exciting to be here at this moment talking about this time and these people. I'd like to talk for a little while about FDR, the Depression, the book, but then I would like to throw it up to comments and questions because obviously this is a subject we all know something about, we all have ideas about, and I'd love to get a conversation going. So just to begin, my book opens with a little dispatch from Edmund Wilson, the famous writer, who he toured Chicago in the summer of 1932, and he found what he called a sea of misery. Everywhere he looked, he saw people without food, without medicine, without shelter. And the worst scenes he encountered, he writes in this essay, were at the city garbage dumps. One dump he visited, there was a mob of 100 men, women, and children digging into the garbage with their hands and with sticks. And he wrote that even the spoiled meat was claimed because the foragers could cut out the worst parts or sprinkle it with baking soda to neutralize the taste and the smell. It's a, gripping, horrible account that gives you a sense of the way things were. Now, of course, it wasn't just Chicago. In the early 1930s, writers were filing reports like this one from all across America. In New York, where I'm from, formerly middle-class people were living in shacks along the East River and in Central Park. In Appalachia, school children were collapsing in class from malnutrition. Since the crash of 1929, the stock market had plunged 85%. A quarter of the workforce was without jobs. In the cities, there were long lines outside of soup kitchens, and actually just the other day in New York, a woman came up to me and told me that she personally saw the families on the sidewalks who had been evicted from their homes surrounded by the furniture and their belongings, which was a common sight in New York and other cities back then. In the rural areas, the farmers were leaving the land because it didn't pay to plant crops. There wasn't enough money in it. So at this moment, Americans were crying out to the federal government to help. But President Hoover refused to acknowledge how bad things were. As the Depression held on for year after brutal year, he began to admit that the crisis was real, but he still refused to provide the kind of relief that was needed. Hoover believed in the free market, and he had a commitment to rugged individualism. He wrote a whole book about it that convinced him that giving government relief to the victims of the Depression would only damage them. So in 1932, there's this great election, and FDR promises a different approach. FDR's vision of how the government should respond to the Great Depression was so different that Hoover declared the election to be a choice not between two men, but two philosophies. Roosevelt's philosophy, of course, won in a landslide. So when FDR took office, March 4th, 1933, he begins to chart a new course. That course was determined during his famous first 100 days in office, which is the subject of the book I've just written. The 100 days began, of course, with that remarkable inaugural address. We all know it. And after declaring that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, FDR promised action and action now. He followed that speech with 2 fireside chats and then a flurry of well-attended press conferences. FDR's great communication skills helped him to reassure a despairing nation. But more than his words, it was his extraordinary actions that really raised the nation's spirits. In the 100 days, Roosevelt offered up what the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. called a presidential barrage of ideas and programs unlike anything known to American history. In 100 days, FDR pushed 15 major laws through Congress. He created an alphabet soup of new agencies, the AAA, the CCC, the FERA, to bring relief to farmers, industry, and the unemployed. Now, when FDR was inaugurated, that first day, March 4th, the whole banking system had collapsed. Literally every bank in the country had closed. There were state holidays and bank holidays in all 48 states. Thousands of banks had already failed, and many people had lost their life savings. Within days of taking office, Roosevelt had signed the Emergency Banking Act, which saved the banking system. It was said at the time that capitalism was saved in 8 days. Same time that Roosevelt is sworn in, farmers were in their second decade of a localized Farm Belt depression that had started at the end of World War I. Hoover had done little for them, but in a matter of weeks, FDR produced a revolutionary new law, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which propped up farm prices by paying farmers not to grow crops. Roosevelt also rescued the urban unemployed, and remember, unemployment then was 25%. He created the first federal relief program, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and two major public works programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent 250,000 jobless young people out into nature to plant trees and reclaim the land. The National Industrial Recovery Act allocated $3.3 billion for government work projects. And there was more. Roosevelt passed the Truth and Securities Act, the first federal law regulating the stock market, and he created the Tennessee Valley Authority, a new kind of regional entity to improve conditions in one of the poorest parts of the country. No presidential administration had ever done so much so fast. So it's hard to imagine the 100 days without FDR in charge. He was so confident and charismatic that the beleaguered American people trusted him without reservation. In his first week in office, 450,000 people wrote to him at the White House. After FDR revived the banking system in 8 days, even the skeptics were won over. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, declared, "I guess at your next election we'll make it unanimous." So Roosevelt was a compelling leader, and because of that, he's gotten almost all of the credit for the accomplishments of the 100 days. Today, a lot of people assume that FDR came into office with a specific plan that was called the New Deal. But it wasn't like that at all. FDR had coined the phrase New Deal during the campaign in his acceptance speech to the Democratic National Convention, but he had never explained what the New Deal would be. During the campaign, in a famous speech at Atlanta's Oglethorpe University, he had promised to respond to the Depression with bold, persistent experimentation. And during the 100 days, that's what he did. He experimented. The truth is, when FDR came into office, he did not fully believe in the principles we now consider to be the heart of the New Deal. Today, we think of the New Deal as standing for heavy deficit spending to combat economic depression. We associate the New Deal with a generous program of federal relief, as welfare was then called, and we think of massive public works jobs programs. But when FDR took office, he was not sure he believed in any of these. Roosevelt, who had just completed 4 years as a progressive governor of New York, clearly had liberal instincts. He wanted to help the victims of the Depression, but he was conflicted. He was also by nature a fiscal conservative who did not believe in heavy government spending. In the 1932 campaign, he had attacked Hoover for overspending and promised to adopt a stern and unremitting administration policy of living within our income. So FDR's commitment both to spending more and spending less created a built-in tension in the 100 days. FDR had another problem. He was not an expert on the issues the nation faced. Raymond Moley, his closest aide, said he doubted either he or Roosevelt could have passed an exam in introductory college economics. So to come up with the specific programs that emerged in 100 days, Roosevelt had to look to the people around him. A more ideological president would have surrounded himself with people who shared his particular vision. But FDR chose cabinet members and top aides with diverse beliefs. In the 100 days, his advisors included social workers who advocated ambitious relief programs and businessmen who argued for cutting the budget. There were supporters of factory workers, farmers, and bankers. Roosevelt listened to all of them. When the time came for a final decision, FDR called these people in, the cabinet members, the congressmen, and the staff to discuss the options, and then he made his ruling. He was weighing what was the best policy, but also what he thought would work politically. Sam Rayburn, the Texas Democrat who would later become House Speaker, said FDR was the best jury to listen and decide that I ever saw. From informal meetings like this with FDR, the policies of the 100 days emerged. So Roosevelt's leadership style meant that his close advisors had enormous influence and a rare chance to shape history. In my book, I argue that 5 members of his inner circle played an extraordinary role in developing the policies of the 100 days and really in building modern America. And I believe history has given them far too little credit. These 4 men and 1 woman, Raymond Moley, Lewis Douglas, Henry Wallace, Harry Hopkins, and Francis Perkins, did not necessarily have the biggest titles in the administration, although Wallace and Perkins were both in the cabinet, and they were not necessarily the closest to Roosevelt, although Raymond Moley and Lewis Douglas were part of what they called the breakfast cabinet. They met with FDR at his bedside